Hello, my name is Mike'l Gregory, and I am excited to be here. My pronouns are he, him, his, and I am a third year here at the University of San Francisco, majoring in communication studies with minors in biology and African American studies on the pre-medical track. It is so awesome that I'm here to have this conversation with these two awesome men. But before we go ahead and jump into that, I just want to state a little bit why I came to USF and what this school has done for me. So when I came to USF, I knew I wanted to be here, and I knew I wanted to be here because I knew I wanted to stay in the community and do the work of community. And as I've been here, it has been an awesome experience as a Black scholar, as an Esther Madrid's diversity scholar. It has shown me so much just about myself and what community engagement looks like and how community engagement ought to be. From the Black Scholars trip that we took down south over 10 days, to even my trip that I took with EMDS, to New York and learning just the sociological roots of hip hop and culture, all has been so amazing, and I'm grateful for it. Overall, I'm proud to say that I attend USF because it has one of the most diverse student populations in the country. Our student population comes from all 50 states and over all 100 countries. We're ranked number 5 amongst all universities in the nation for ethnic and racial diversity. 3/4 of our students are international students of color, and 1/3 of our students represent first generation in their family to attend college. I am a part of that group. Diversity and social justice is at the very core of who we are as a Jesuit university. And we are dedicated to making our community and our world a more inclusive place for all. Today, amidst a global health pandemic that is causing disproportionate suffering and death in communities of color, we are also struggling as a society to balance our ideals with the pervasive reality of evil and evil of racism. Last year, the university announced an ambitious fundraising goal that included an aspiration we embrace as our school motto. At USF, we changed the world from here. I'm honored to join 2 personal connections, both of whom have been changing the world day after day. San Francisco Police Chief William Scott, who was sworn in by Mayor Ed Lee on January 23, 2017, joining SFPD after serving 27 years in the LA Police Department. Chief Scott grew up in Birmingham, Alabama. He attended the University of Alabama with a degree in accounting and is also a graduate of senior management of Institute of Policy. He brings to the department a keen focus on community policing and experience implementing major reforms. He leads SFPD as it undertakes key reforms laid out by the Department of Justice. Now, Dr. Jones served as Reverend Martin Luther King Jr.'s lawyer, strategic advisor, and draft speechwriter from 1960 until Dr. King's assassination on April 4, 1968. He is the founding director of the USF Institute for Nonviolence and Social Justice. The Institute advances the theory and practice of transformative nonviolence to overcome poverty, racism, militarism, and the build of a loved community. Dr. Jones and Chief Scott, I am so honored to be here with each of you. Thank you for sharing your time today.
Delighted to be here.
As am I. Thank you very much for having me.
Awesome. Let's go ahead and jump on in then. Following the brutal killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis several months ago, millions of Americans have been going through an unprecedented reckoning concerning the history and reality of racial injustice in America. At the center of national attention is the unrelenting persistence of police violence against Black people and other people in our country. Each of you is in a unique position of moral leadership to address this issue. Dr. Jones as a civil rights leader alongside Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and Chief Scott as the police chief of a major city in America. Chief Scott, from these very different perspectives, how do you understand the crisis and the opportunity facing our nation today?
Well, I'll start with the positive, with the opportunity. I believe personally that we have a tremendous opportunity in front of us for real substantive change in policing across the nation. And when you see the energy behind some of the protests and the movement of really police reform as it relates to specifically African-American policing in African-American community, policing of African-American people, Black people, we have a real opportunity. And how we got here, I think we have to look at that as well, because the history of how we got here is really important and an important part of this conversation. Because although as tragic as the killing of George Floyd was, that's really one incident of a history of those types of incidents, and many of them never captured on camera like what we see today. And I think people that remember the history, people that have lived through the history, those things I think have caused and influenced the momentum and the movement that you see right now. And it really brings an opportunity for change. Now, just shorten this by saying this. In the last 2 months, 3 months since the incident in Minneapolis, you've seen overnight police departments across this country that have changed policies, changed use of force policies, calls for legislation. I've been in this business for 31 years now, and I've never seen the willingness like I do today, of the willingness to change. And that's not to say that we're there yet, but we have a tremendous opportunity because of that willingness to change. People are listening. There's never been a movement this powerful, I think, in our generation. So it offers a tremendous opportunity, but we have to not forget our history. Things are the way they are because of the way they've been. We have generations upon generations of systemic racism, of particularly in terms of this nation, that has to be addressed. And some of these underlie what we see that manifest themselves in what we saw and what we continue to see in policing.
Totally. I agree with that. Dr. Jones, from your perspective, how do you understand the crisis and the opportunity facing our nation today?
For me, it's like the more we see things which we think are different, the more they stay the same.
Mm.
I find it to be morally challenging that when the Kerner Commission report issued a report on February 29, 1968, dealing with what had been a nationwide outbreak of rioting. And in that report, they sought to understand why were Negroes, as we were referred to them, why were Negroes rioting in various cities? What were the causes? They convened a commission of very distinguished persons to just look at it objectively and coldly. And one of the things they identified principally, for example, they talked about the deeply held grievance, as they described it, by people of color. And what was the number one of those grievances was their treatment by the police. They had poverty, housing, unemployment, and all that. And so that, and they talked about the need to reduce high risk of crime in low-income Black communities and so forth. Mm-hmm. So I'm saying to myself, this is not, this picture I've seen before. The question, why, what is different in terms of the response? Now, what is different is if part of the nation, because of the technology which we now have, as you say, a picture's worth 1,000 words. Okay.
Get it. Thank you.
No amount of editorials, no amount of preaching speeches and so forth. The pictures, not just of George Floyd, but you forget there were pictures, I think in North Carolina, one of the states where a policeman was seen shooting in the back a suspect. And what is sad about this is that strangely as it might seem, I am not anti-police. I'm pro-police. I actually, I believe police are essential, but the crisis is police have exercised the use of lethal force as the first option in effecting what might have been an otherwise lawful arrest.
See,
It could have been
agree
a bonus, but they exercised the first option rather than using it as a last option. Okay. And then when you drill down deeper and you get an attitude as is captured by some of these videos, by the police people themselves, then you have to say, hold on, this can't be tolerated. This can't be tolerated. So I understand, while I don't agree with defunding the police, I understand why someone can say, well, hold on, but they're not going to be accountable. But they're not going to listen to anything. Well, we know the money talks, the old thing. The golden rule, as the gold makes the rules.
Right.
Okay.
You said something very poignant, and just talking about the experience that we see this on camera, and when where it's coming from. And it just reminds me, or it makes me think of the next question in terms of how do we look at that, like from the journey, like maybe for Chief Scott, like you growing up in Birmingham, Alabama, how did you experience some of the Jim Crow segregation and just police violence in general in the South?
Well, as a young boy in the early 1970s, a lot of what I was told and taught by members of my family, including my mom and grandparents, they were in the protests and in the streets, and the images that we have seen over and over again of the church bombings, which impacted my wife's family directly, because her dad taught 3 of the 4 little girls at 16th Street Baptist Church who were killed. He was a pallbearer at the funeral, and these are conversations and images that will never go away. The protests, the pictures of the Birmingham Police Department, and I'm sure Dr. Jones was probably in the heat of some of those movements with Bull Connor and the fire, the water hoses and the dogs being sicked on protesters and things like that. So as I entered elementary school in 1970, the schools were no longer lawfully segregated, but they were segregated. And I recall, going to elementary school that had been pretty much an all-white elementary school, and we were one of a few Black families when we moved into the neighborhood on my block. I think we were the first Black family on my block, and the for sale signs went up overnight, and within 2 to 3 years, that elementary school went from all white to virtually all Black. And you then started to see, which I didn't realize at the time, the disinvestment in some of these communities, stores leaving, some of the programs in the schools, the arts and things like that slowly just disappeared. And, I witnessed that. I didn't really understand it at the time. You're a kid, you're just doing what you do. But as I got older, I really understood it, particularly when I got to college and saw the education that I had or was afforded the opportunity to have compared to some of my peers, classes that they had taken that we didn't even have offered. So those are, just a few of the things, my parents not being able to live in neighborhoods that they wanted to live in, or not being able to get jobs that they may have been qualified for, not even able to get educational opportunities. It was better for my generation, and it's better for my kids' generation. So I will say progress is happening, but those things are things that are rooted in, in our nation's fabric and history, and we still pay the price of those things even today.
Indeed. I also agree, just in terms of seeing it and how you see it, and having college professors bring that out for you. For me, that was me sitting in my first Black Scholars class with Dr. Candace Harrison, and then talking a little bit more about it the following year with Dr. Stephanie Sears. And I definitely see like just divestment and just looking at how communities change and then how it affects students, learnings and their outcomes. But just in terms for you, Dr. Jones, you were with Dr. King in Birmingham during the 1963 protests. So that firsthand experience, what was your experience in Birmingham, and what lessons did you and Dr. King take away from some of the experience that Chief Scott essentially talked about?
The lessons and experience that we took away, and that I repetitively say over and over again, What we saw in Birmingham and what we saw recently raises a repetitive question. Just what kind of nation are we? You know why Birmingham shocked the nation? It's because you didn't have cell phones and so forth, but you had the evening news. And so you saw when people saw fire hoses and police dogs attacking Negro children, young people, trying to demonstrate peacefully against segregation, and saw that, and they said, well, hold on, what kind of country permits this to happen? And this is repetitively the same question being asked today. What kind of country are we that permits a man to plead and say 8 minutes and 40-something seconds, maybe 6 seconds, I can't breathe, I can't breathe? What kind of country permits this? And it'd be one thing if it was a one-off incident. But what we find is that it's a series of more than one incident. And the pattern, consistent pattern is, as I say, I start off with the presumption that the police are not inherently bad, okay? It's like, it sounds like an old thing some of my best friends are. Well, the fact of the matter is, I knew that many years of a period of time, I knew people in the police and so forth. And there are many black members of the police force other than William Scott, in different cities. Why do, quote, black people join the police? Okay? Because they see that as an opportunity to want to go and exercise leadership where they can play a constructive role in their community. Little did Chief Scott and other leaders, particularly black leaders of the police department, anticipate was that there was this octopus that got into the police department. These unions, in New York, like the Police Benevolent Association. So you have a police department structure, but you have it being infected with a virus where the police go, they listen to the police chief, but they're also listening to another voice. Another voice says, okay, you do what you have to do because that's what the police chief says. But at the end of the day, this is what you really do. Okay? And this is what a number of people are coming to the conclusion that, okay, they don't listen. All right, so clearly enough's enough. All right? So I don't want to hear anything else. Defund the police. I don't want to hear anything else. All police are bad. Not so. Not so, but the confidence in the integrity of the police, I will say it now for the record. I think it is, I didn't think it could be any lower than as it occurred in the Kerner Commission report, 1968. I didn't think it could get any lower. But guess what? It was perceived to be lower by principally African Americans. But now it's perceived to be lower, listen to me carefully, by a majority of people in this country. The Black Lives Matter movement is not it's called the Black Lives Matter movement, okay? But in fact, the Black Lives Matter movement is the largest unprecedented movement of non-Black people that this country has ever seen.
I think it's a lot of resilience and strength that has to come from, one, African-American people, and two, the young people that started this movement with Black Lives Matter. And it really just reminds me of just the historic I Have a Dream speech delivered on August 28th in 1963 from at the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. As Dr. King kind of addressed the criticism and like the protesting in the streets of our cities, he left us with a profound quote. Those who are asking for devotees of civil rights, when will you be satisfied? And he responded by saying, we can never be satisfied as long as a Negro is the victim of the unspeakable horrors of police brutality.
That's correct.
And here we are 60 years later. And I think my question is now, what do each of you see has changed over all these years, and what has remained the same? Like, as you in this position, Chief Scott, what are you seeing as the parallels, or what are you seeing as the things that have changed, looking from when you were in elementary school to now being in this position of power over such a major city?
Well, much has changed. I spoke of the experience of, as a child, moving into a neighborhood that, well, we knew we weren't welcome. Like I said, for sale signs went up overnight, and people, moved literally within weeks, days, and months. And now we can live where we can afford to live without that happening. But at the same time, we still have some vestiges of that, what we see across the country, even in our own city, where, somebody looks like they don't belong in a neighborhood. And we get these, calls to the police department. Oh, this person doesn't belong here. They're suspicious. So although legally things have changed, I think morally as a country, many things have changed. But we still have some vestiges of those sentiments about who belongs where and who fits where. Educationally, I mean, the education gaps probably are as bad as they were in the 60s, particularly for Blacks in this country. Educational achievement, wealth disparities, and things like that, although they have improved some, we have barely moved the needle on those factors. And those factors play into everything else. Healthcare, the ability to open your own business, or the ability to send your kids to college or get a higher education. All these things that ultimately level the playing field in terms of equity, we still have just so far to go in this nation on those issues. And like I said, some things have changed. Those of us that can want to live in whatever neighborhood, we can do that. We can go to the schools that we want to go if we are qualified, which brings another issue because of the disparities in education. That scale is not equitable. Right. And so, although I do say, I tell my children, my kids who are adults now, things are better for them than they were for me. Things are better for me than they were for my parents. God knows things are better for my parents than what was for my grandparents and great grandparents. Because now we're talking about slavery and just after slavery, peonage, right. In the city that I came from, vagrancy laws and things like that don't exist anymore. However, we still have the vestiges of those structures in our society, and we have to keep working and keep pressing until that goes away.
And I think this is one reason that I am so appreciative of just young people's impact on these protests, on just the Black Lives Matter movement in general, as it makes up one of the largest protest movements in US history. Millions of participants of all races and generations. And it makes me think just a little bit more about what you see as the biggest impact this movement is having on our society.
I see, for example, may I speak? I see, for example, that it's opened up eyes of people who maybe did not see it as clearly as they now see it. At the end of the day, it's about power. It's about the exercise of power. They listen to the Black Lives Matter movement in Ferguson, Missouri. They listen to it in connection with other instances. Okay. But something was like an inflection or tipping point. The sheer power of the immorality of what happened to George Floyd was like the tipping point. This sort of like summed up everything that had happened, gone on before. It connected to the Eric Gardner. It connected to all the things. Everything began to be connected. And so people began to say, hold on. Just as people looked at dogs biting young kids in Birmingham and firing, they're raising the questions. What is the Black Lives Matter movement? They don't say what I'm saying to you. But in fact, what they are asking the nation to ask themselves, what kind of country are we? What kind of country is America where we can have the police whom we have come to, we know we need the police, but now we see there's been instance after instance after instance after instance after instance after instance where the police force, the police that have been vested with the power of the state has simply abused us. And they've said, enough's enough. Enough's enough.
And many Black Lives Matter activists are organizing around defund the police. We heard this, you guys addressed it, but just to go a little bit more, in response to cities throughout the country are considering plans to reduce police budgets and reallocate the savings to investments in social services, public health, and education in underserved low-income Black communities. These basic services have traditionally, as we all know, have been underfunded. And in July, Mayor London Breed, who is a USF alumni, announced that there would be a $120 million cut to the San Francisco Police and Sheriff's Department over the next 2 years, specifically to be spent on addressing these disparities in African-American Black communities. Chief Scott, tell me more about your thoughts around this strategy and what this looks like.
Well, it really starts from what I said a few minutes ago. I mean, who can argue with the need to reallocate resources to communities who most need those resources? Now, the reallocation of resources from the police budget, I know the mayor is going to do that thoughtfully. I believe our city will do that thoughtfully because we do still need police services, particularly in Black communities that are the hardest hit by violence in this city. Even in the city that I came from, in Los Angeles, hardest hit by violent crime, hardest hit by some of the very issues that some of what the refunding will hopefully help to address. There has to be a balance. I've seen polls recently, Gallup poll being one of them, where when Black Americans were polled, they, for the most part, were not in favor of, total defunding of police departments. And I don't advocate for that either. I have said publicly, and I'll continue to say, I'm very much okay with reallocation of some of our budget to address some of these other issues. I think it's the right thing to do morally. I think ultimately it's going to get us to a better place. And we have to look at, public safety and the health of a community in more holistic ways, and not just the lack of violent crime or the lack of drug sales. I mean, there's so many other things that compose of a healthy community. And I applaud, the mayor and others that are taking this on. We will do our part. However, on the other side of that spectrum, we can't be stripped of a budget to the point that we can't operate it in some of the very communities that need us the most. Community policing, reform, all these things that go hand in hand with good constitutional, moral, purposeful policing, those investments need to be made as well, because
it really just reminds me of the conversation that you and I had on Dr. Marshall's radio station back in 2016 when we were talking, how are we going to be intentional about making police reform? How are we going to be intentional about investing in our communities? And as someone who grew up as a first generation student, like in Bayview, Hunters Point, a community where it's like the last of the Blacks, like the Blacks in San Francisco, this to me is just like so profound, and I'm appreciative just because I know what it's like to see my peers going without. And I know what it's like to also go into other communities in order to get education, because it doesn't reflect the same education that's in my community. And I think you really talk a lot about it, about just that it's important that this is what it's meant to do, while still being moderate in terms of making sure that we are keeping it at a good pace based off polls and all those good things. But overall, I feel like I'm very appreciative of this policy that Mayor London Breed has just put into action.
See, a number of the people in the Black Lives Matter movement, they have not been as fortunate enough to go to USF or business school or colleges, but they're in the pop culture. They know, they watch movies and television, and they read books, and they also, some of them have a biblical thing, and they talk about the golden rule, and they watch things, and they have enough sense know that somehow money is power.
Right.
They don't quite know how to do it, but they have enough sense that in this country, in the United States, money is power. Okay, so they concluded they may not know how it works, but they're starting with if you take away the money from them, they're not going to have the power to hurt us. All right. Now that's elementary. So what we have to make clear, and I've said this, I repeat it now. African American, Black communities need the police more today, comparatively, than any other community of people of color, than any other community of people of color today. I believe the police are more needed today to enable people in the African community to fulfill their aspirations, being able to go to school. I mean, when I was in Los Angeles and a group of mothers came to me and they started to cry. And I said, well, what's the problem? He said, Mr. Jones, can you tell us, several of them had students who were in high school. He says, when will I have to not wonder whether my son, 14, 15, 16-year-old son, is going to return home to me? He's not going to be killed by the police or killed in the crossfire of gang violence. Okay, so as much as I respect my colleagues, my colleagues, the people who have worked in the Black Lives Matter movement, I've said so in writing. I've said so publicly. I'm opposed as a operational concept, defunding the police. What I want to do, I want to reallocate the resources that remain.
And I think that's something that we all can agree on. Right. Just looking at it, it's like, we need you, but we also need you to listen to us. And we need you to understand how we need you and how we need you to operate in our community. Right. But that takes giving the voice back to us and hearing what we need, and then coming in and assisting us as needed. And this brings me to my next question, really, is like, society has focused attention on this increased militarization of police departments in recent years. We all know this, we've all seen this. And in some of the most intense demonstrations, police carry large weapons, wear military style gear, and even use military equipment like tanks. I have my own personal thoughts, but I really want to understand a little bit more of your thoughts. And Chief Scott, do you even think this is necessary and helpful? And as we look at the title of this event of a reimagining policing, how can we find a better policing model?
Well, yeah, militarization, and it means different things to different people, but I'll just start with this city. You know, what we saw in the end of May, the beginning of June across the country, and these images on the news with, you know, riots happening and police departments acting or reacting to what was happening in their cities. I'm very pleased to say you didn't see those images in this city. Now we had our share of issues and we had a couple of really trying nights, but you didn't see that in this city, and you didn't see that because it really, number one, we have policies that prevent that type of behavior. And as Dr. Jones said earlier, you know, policies are only as good as the ability to lead them where people follow, the ability to enforce them when people don't follow them, and to make sure that you have a culture where people adhere to those policies that are in place. So, you know, where you saw in some places tear gas being used on, you know, overwhelmingly peaceful protests, where you saw some of the munitions, the rubber bullets as commonly referred to. We didn't do that here, but we didn't do it because of the leadership and because of the policy structure and because of the accountability and because it's about doing the right thing and listening to the community that you serve. Now, I have to say, you know, in terms of equipment and militarization, you know, in some respects, a lot of that equipment is really for the worst case scenario, where you have a mass shooting incident where, and we've had these happen, unfortunately, with more and more frequency over the last few years, where the people who are perpetrating these shootings have armaments that are military grade armaments, AK-47s and high power rifles and things that when those incidents happen, we do need a resource to take care of those situations. That's not to be used on a First Amendment, type of situation. A mass shooting and a protest are two different things. So, being a practitioner in policing, I do say, I've seen those situations occur where, thank goodness, we did have the equipment we needed to neutralize the situation and keep people from dying. And those things often get lost in the conversation because they happen so infrequently that people don't think about them until they happen. It takes training because there are low frequency events. It takes training, it takes preparation, and you do need that in your equipment because unfortunately these things are happening. They're happening across the world, and they're definitely happening in these countries. But when we talk about militarization and you see the tanks and you see what we saw in Ferguson a few years ago, I think that's where the line gets crossed, where it shocks people's consciousness, particularly when you're talking about a protest situation where you have outbursts of violence, but by and large, you have a peaceful situation. You have to be very purposeful, very intentional, very, very surgical in handling those situations. And oftentimes, bigger cities where we have these events more frequently, oftentimes are better prepared to handle these events because we do have them more frequently. So we have policies in place. They're not a shock to our system. Some of cities that don't experience that, sometimes they do struggle, unfortunately. But I do think there's a need for some equipment. Mm-hmm. I think we always have to revisit police work as an evolution. As Dr. Jones said, 1968, I read that report many, many times. And some of the things that were talked about and discussed in that report in 1968, the President Johnson created that commission to look at policing in America. Some of those topics are as relevant today as they were then, and we're having the same conversations. We always need to reevaluate, determine what we're using today. Will it still be relevant 5 years from now, 10 years from now? Maybe not.
San Francisco is blessed, Chief Scott, to have you as its chief of police. And I'm sure the mayor knows that, and it's evident by your conversation here today. Yes. But my overview, my experience as I look across the country, and as I've not made any detailed study, as I read the news and I read very carefully, regrettably, the mindset and the attitude of the Chief William Scotts, it's a growing minority, but it does not reflect the majority of the police establishment. Fortunate for us in San Francisco, we are lucky to have you. We are lucky to have police chiefs like you in other places who can speak out. And so I think one of the, if I may be so humble and respectful here, is that one of the ways I think the police chiefs like you can really be helpful is to reach out and have communications with the Black Lives Matter movement and let them know we hear you, we understand you, okay? Because we have to give them a sense of confidence that just because you get up in the morning and put on a uniform, right, you put a badge and a gun, that doesn't per se make you a bad person. Yeah. You know what I'm saying? That there are a growing number of police chiefs who understand just like you understand and articulated here today. But if we don't do that, and I'm not saying I don't want to put a lot of stuff on your shoulders, but I'm simply saying that if they're not more police chiefs like you, that the Black Lives Matter movement can have the experience of understanding what you're seeking to do, we're in some very difficult times.
And I definitely echo the same notions and sentiments. It's about being seen, and this is what it takes to be seen. And I'm just appreciative that we are seeing people see us and see the movement and see the work that needs to be done. And just by it starting with this allocation means a lot to a lot of people. You addressed a little bit about, Dr. Jones, you addressed a little bit about this idea of putting on the suit and putting on the badge and all that good stuff and what that feels like. In the past, police violence has been dismissed at the work of a few bad apples. Today, this explanation is rejected by millions of citizens as an excuse to hide the reality of a much more systemic problem in policing. Dr. Jones, what do you think these perceptions are especially widespread in Black communities?
Why do I think they're?
Yes, why do you think these perceptions are especially widespread in Black communities?
Because these perceptions confirm what they have actually experienced, or what they have had a member of their family experience, or what they've seen. You know, it's one thing for me to tell you, well, you know what happened to George Floyd. Right. So one thing, okay? But when you find out that George Floyd might be one of the extremes, but guess what? There are other instances in which police have used excessive power and force. And so they began to think, okay? So, you know, everybody's presumed innocent until proven guilty, but I gotta tell you, the police right now are up against a presumption. They have to earn the credibility. Right now, I would say the majority, I'm not gonna say the overwhelming, but I was saying the majority opinion of the police and the people of color, they do not assume that the police are going to be good people. They assume, just as I said in my opening statement, okay? Why is it that if you're a police person, why do you choose to exercise the choice of lethal force as the first option in effecting an arrest that might have otherwise been lawful? You know, that's what's happening. Going for the gun rather than using that as the last option. And they don't have to have a PhD or a law degree and so forth. These people see, and now with the social media and with the whole technology, you know, they don't have to read a lot of books. You know, their eyes tell them. They don't have to read a lot of pamphlets. You know, they don't have to know much about Frederick Douglass or Malcolm X or Dr. King and so forth. They know about these names, but they see with their own eyes, their living experience.
And exactly, true, very much so. And you mentioned the police unions. So I would even ask the question to you, Chief Scott, is, do you think the police unions have too much power? And do you think that police culture in San Francisco needs to change? And if so, where, how, what does that look like?
Well, I'll start with the culture question. I do think there are parts of the culture that needs to change, that is changing. And I, you know, one of the things that Dr. Jones talked about force options, and, you know, even the drawing or pulling out of the gun. You know, we just changed our use of force policy, and one of the new features of this current change in policy that just happened last month is, for the first time in our department's history, even pulling out the gun now, even if you don't point it at anybody, requires an evaluation as to whether it's appropriate and proper. Because here's the reality, in my view, just my professional viewpoint. When you look at the number of contacts across this country, and even in the city per day, per year, I don't care how you slice it, and you look at how many of them result in the use of force, you go from, you know, contacts being way out here and the number of force being very, very small. And they are significant when they happen, particularly when somebody's life is taken or somebody's seriously injured. So I don't want to, by any stretch of the imagination, lead anybody to believe I'm minimizing that, because I'm not. But the reality is all those other contacts also matter. And those other contacts with how people are treated, how many times a gun's pulled out where it's never even documented, where people
Hello.
are stopped on traffic stops, or they come in contact with police officers, and it's not even documented. See, those are the stories that I hear. When you talk about people who were traumatized on a traffic stop because a gun came out. Why did the gun come out? Those type of things have to be evaluated for appropriateness, and those type of things are far more regular than actual shootings or lethal uses of force. Those contexts have to matter. We have to treat people with respect and dignity, no matter the situation. So it has to go beyond just looking at the force. Our policy has changed, so now we're looking at those things. We're evaluating those things. We're tracking those things, and those are the things that really allow us, number one, to see what officers are doing, and number two, if there's a problem, to address that culture. So things are changing. I think there are a lot of good things culturally with this police department, with our police department, but we know that in terms of the African American, the Black population, there are things that are just out of whack. The number of stops, the number of arrests, even the pointing of firearms, which is one thing that we've been tracking since 2015, late 2015. We brought that down by 60%. Just the pointing of firearms, which in this department is a reportable use of force, if an officer points a firearm intentionally at an individual. It's been brought down by 60% over the last 4 years. The biggest drop is the pointing of firearm at Black people. That's the biggest drop. That's a good thing. We still have a long way to go, though, because all these other contacts are happening where firearms aren't even brought out. And if people aren't treated with dignity and respect, that's what puts in people's minds what they think about their police department.
Right.
And it just reminds you of implicit bias and addressing implicit bias. And to even go back a little bit further, to go back, I think I probably have missed it. Just addressing the question of police unions and power, and your thoughts around it being whether it is too much.
Yeah, well, unions are very powerful, and the union here is no exception. They're very powerful, and as Dr. Jones pointed out, they have a significant voice in policing. And me as chief of police, I set the tone under the department of leadership and all that, and me and the command staff and the captains, even down to line level supervisors and sergeants. But the union have a voice, and they have a tremendous influence.
See,
they have a purpose, they advocate for their members and all that. But the is, the discussion has been on the power of the unions to influence things in some ways, in ways that impede reform and progress.
This is what I won't say I know, but a lot of information leads me to agree with what you confirm. So that's why I said earlier it's about political power. I said, okay, I got it. So we have to I want to let the police unions know that this is a different day now. We understand the dynamics of political power. And so we are going to amass political power that is going to hold them accountable. The police unions have to know that this day of sort of their unilateral exercise of political, those days are over. Those days are over because there's a new generation and a new accumulation of power in the communities, and say, we are not going to let you exercise that political power. And we're going to go. And that's why people who don't have a lot of degrees, but they understand. That's the first thing they understand is money. Okay. So they say, okay, if they don't have money, they can't hurt us. If we cut off their funding. Okay. Now however these unions, powerful they may be, and however they may want to collect the dues from their members, if they know that the ultimate source of money is not going to be as readily available as it was in the past, they have to think carefully. All I'm simply saying, I welcome the challenge. I welcome dealing with the police unions on the basis that I'm very comfortable with. Let's deal with the basis of power on power. Yeah. I like that. Okay.
And I will say, if I could just add on this question, I've reached out and they've reached out to me about moving forward. You know, I owe it to the people of the city, to this department, to work with the unions as best I can, and we have to balance that. We have to balance that to make sure that we are moving in the right direction. So our union came out publicly and said that they're willing to do that. We're gonna do everything we can to work, or me from my seat, to work with the unions to move us forward. But accountability has to happen, and I agree with Dr. Jones. It has to happen for the police department and for the unions.
My whole life has been pro-labor and pro-union. I mean, that's just the nature of the kind of experiences I've had. I haven't been an anti-union. I've been pro-union all my life and pro-labor, okay? But I also know the objective facts are there have been some instances in which unions have been corrupted. You know, I'm not going to talk about any particular union, but we know the leadership of some unions have been corrupted, okay? And so what, I want to go to the jugular vein. I want to go right to these unions, the police unions, that believe they have so much power. We're going to challenge them, you know, because what we have to do is start providing resources of candidates who can run against them within the union. Unions are not democracy, you know. Any union changes, you know. I mean, the Teamsters is an example of that. I mean, you know, you can change it.
And Dr. Jones,
what?
Dr. Jones, it makes me think about just your presence and in the power that you have when you talk about police, and like even to think about a totally different idea, but still very much connected, the idea of homelessness. And we know it's a major problem in San Francisco that you care about deeply, that you've expressed. And addressing this, do you have any concerns about city policing, about homeless people, and the role of the police in this, in terms of unions or actual people that we see on the streets?
Well, the police are in a very difficult situation. You see, I don't hold the police as, quote, the bad guys or the bad persons on the questions of homeless. I point my finger at the aggregate of corporate power and wealth in San Francisco. Now, I don't care what anybody says to you at USF. I don't care what anybody says. I'm telling you, nobody has to agree with me. Okay, I don't. I'm so confident in my point of view because I believe in facts. Okay, you can't tell me that companies that have the capacity to do this extraordinary technology, build a machine or a rover machine that can walk on Mars, can do all these technologies, can do all these. You mean to tell me that the collection of all this brain power and technology, I mean, give me a break. If you can design a rocket to send a machine to go dig up some dirt on Mars, you mean to tell me you can't find a way of dealing with the homelessness in the Tenderloin? No, you can't tell me that.
And Chief, I feel like you definitely know this, but San Francisco has been at the forefront of placing homeless people in hotels. Do you think there's been a reduction in crime because of this?
Well, crime is down overall. And I don't know, I mean, I can't say anecdotally otherwise whether that is a direct impact of, placement. We do know that there is some criminal activity among, homeless encampments and the like, because they report it and we respond to those calls for service. But I don't want to give anybody the impression that I'm associating homelessness with crime in and of itself, because I think that's kind of a broad generalization that can be dangerous. Some people out that are unhoused, unsheltered, or there because of whatever circumstances that got them there, and they're not committing any types of crimes. There are others out there that are out there victimizing people, and it doesn't. The status of their housing status really doesn't matter. They're just bad people. So I want to make sure that we keep those lines clear, because criminal activity, regardless of where it's happening or whether the person is housed or unhoused, needs to be addressed. Now, I do say that when we have drug and substance abuse that's intertangled with this issue, we tend to see patterns of behavior. You know, people have to fuel their habits if they don't have the cash to fuel their habits and their addictions. And sometimes that criminal activity is what feeds that. We see chop shops where bicycles are by the 10s and 20 and 30 bicycles, you know, in some of these encampments, and, you know, many of them are stolen. That's the reality of what we face.
I think you hit it on the nail right there in addressing this idea of mental illness and how you see it in homeless people. You see it in so many people who have wound up in the hands of police and jails rather than doctors and mental health care facilities. And I think my question now is, what are the innovative ideas? Do you have any innovative ideas on how this can be improved? Because I feel like when we address this issue, it's possible to address a lot of the systemic roots of homelessness in San Francisco.
Well, you know, you mentioned that. I spent the first half of my day today on a national panel discussion on this very issue. And at San Francisco, we're blessed in many ways. We have resources. And even with the resources we have trouble fulfilling the capacity of getting people in, you know, into beds, people who are in crisis that are taken to hospitals or detox facilities and the like. We are short capacity for the need. And I know that people are working very hard to address that, including our mayor, who's done some really good things to move that in the right direction. But really, for people like me and the officers that are responding to these calls, it's a real big challenge, because, you know, sometimes even when we take people and we take them to be evaluated psychologically and there's a need, the bed space is not there. And sometimes people are discharged back out into the streets, maybe before they're ready, or maybe before they need to be discharged back out on the streets. That's a huge challenge, and it's something that we have to work through as a city. I know a lot of people are working hard to make this situation better, but we have a lot of work to do, and it's challenging because there's not a finite number of people that we're talking about. People come and go, and it ebbs and flows depending on weather patterns and, you know, services that are available here that may not be available in other parts of this area. And we see ebbs and flows of the number of people that we have to deliver service to, and that in and of itself is a challenge. So
you can't address the problem of homelessness unless you also are going to deal with the question of available housing.
Correct.
Okay, and I'm not talking about available housing that is available today as we have this conversation, but somebody has to say, okay, looking at our homeless population, it looks like we're going to require X number of housing units, okay? Then somebody's got to say, well, who's going to do this? Who's going to pay for it? All right. My point is, if the political power and the corporate power want to resolve it, they'll resolve it. But it's really not up to the political power, in my opinion. It goes back, money talks. Okay. And I'm not talking about everybody talks. I'm a great believer in using the resources of the government. I'm also a great believer of being creative. Okay. So
and as you even say creators, I think this is where I believe in actually, like, I believe that this is where young people comes in. This is where college students comes in, because it seems like, not to call it old people, but it seems like people who are more seasoned in the game tend to lose this like vitality or this curiosity and just oomph, this pop that will bring in those innovative ideas. And I think that's where we need to use college students and young people in high school, some of the programs that I've been in that you've seen me in, Chief, to begin to give new innovative thoughts around what this looks like, how this model can be improved, and how we address this. And at that point, run with it and just put money behind it. And I know it's easier said than done, but I feel like even beginning to put the notion out there could hopefully get something in the works.
Michael, I'm so glad you said this, because I know, no, the reason I said this, because sometimes we forget. I really believe in the power of our young people.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? I believe that there's a vast reservoir of talent and skills yet unseen.
Mm-hmm.
All right. I don't know them. I don't know what who they are, the capacity, but I know that they're out there.
I know them. They're my friends. They're my peers. They're the ones who are sitting in classrooms with me.
Okay, well, I'm like an old dinosaur talking about. You know?
Thank you.
No, but I've
there.
Confidence, but I've seen, I've been along the journey. Okay. Mm-hmm. So I've seen from whence I've came and where we are today. And I can, as Dr. King said, not me personally, but as he said so beautifully, the day before he was assassinated, I've been to the mountaintop and I've looked over and I've seen the promised land. I may not be there. Get there with you, but I have seen the promised land. Okay.
It reminds me of a quote that I saw at Studio B.
You are an example, Michael.
Yeah.
You are an example.
Yeah. It reminds me of a quote that I saw at Studio B when I was on the Black Heritage trip. And it said, "I am my ancestors' wildest dreams." And I believe that. And it's just like, I see it in classrooms, I see it amongst my peers, and I just become even more grateful.
Well, that's what I'm talking about.
And yeah, I totally don't even want to badger the bull, but it's there. Young people, reach out to us. Chief will help you. We'll be there. But to even move on, as I know we're coming close to time, Dr. Jones, federal agents have been deployed in Portland and other major cities, even when local police and officials have opposed federal intervention. What do you think about Attorney General Barr testifying to Congress that federal troops were required to protect courthouses and other federal property against what he called violent rioters and anarchists who wreak senseless havoc and destruction on innocent victims?
Well,
does the city of San Francisco have a plan? Oh, yeah, go ahead. I'll wait to throw the second question at you.
That's what William Barr said. It sounds like he is structuring himself to tell a lie. What is this nonsense? What is this? Okay, he's trying to find a basis for the intervention of federal troops or federal power based upon the incapacity of local political authorities to deal with it. Okay, I'm not saying that does not occur in some instances, but as a general rule, for example, this whole thing in Lafayette Square, this whole thing with the president walking into the church and so forth, and having the protesters removed, I could have suggested to the president. I know some very capable Broadway theatrical producers and motion pictures. They could have produced that much more effectively than he. Okay, because production was a failure.
And I think
Barr, as Attorney General, and what so offends me is the Barr went to University of Columbia College, as I did. I think it was a class of '76. I mean, I can't keep my Columbia degree that he went to the same school.
Well, I won't even pin on that one. But Chief Scott, does the city of San Francisco have a plan if the president decides to deploy federal law agents?
Well, we can't. Our plan is to, number one, do the things that we need to do as best as we can do them to not have the need for that in our city. As I talked about how we handled the protests and the aftermath of the protests, and there were real opportunities for bad things to happen here. And I'm so proud of not only of the members of our department, but the community at large, because it takes community cooperation as well. And that's where that communications and community policing and all those relationships that we build up over the years, even with our harshest critics, that's where that really matters. We also have, and I'm not saying that other cities don't, but I know that we do have very good relationships with our local federal partners. You know, all the federal agencies are headed by a special agent in charge. We have very good relationships, and I know they have their own marching orders when things like this happen. But I am confident, just based on prior histories of, or even, you know, exposures to things that could have probably escalated, because we communicated so well and because we worked together so well, that I think we were able to do things in the city where we didn't have escalations of incidents. So I'm confident about that piece. You know, our partners can't control what their bosses in Washington, D.C. do, but I do know this: we want to, as much as we can do, keep things, you know, peaceful in our city. So that's not the issue for us. We can't control everything. You know, we can't control who comes in and protests and all that. We can only control how we interact and how we deliver our services once that happens.
Appreciate that. And I want to just get to this last question, because I think this is the question that so many of my peers, myself, all want to hear. And it's, I want to give each of you a chance to just share personal reflections. Specifically, what advice, counsel, encouragement can you give me as a USF student, and to all my peers who were texting me, asking me the same question, and to them listening right now and learning from this talk? Where do you see hope in the future? The advice, just give it to us. Lay it all on us right now.
May I say something?
Yes, please.
As you mentioned, a very distinguished colleague of mine, Professor Candace,
Harrison,
yeah. She knows, as another of my Professor Taylor, no.
James Taylor.
They know. And other professors that are not Black know. They know a little bit about the history of the African struggle. Can't talk about the whole panoply of people, but I can point to one person that says it all. That's Frederick Douglass. Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never has. It never will.
There it is. There it is.
What we're doing right now, that power we're talking about today, is voting. Voting power. And I won't even tolerate, I won't even dignify a discussion when somebody says, well, it's too, you know, you got to stand in line a long time. Okay, I know I know there are things going on that want to impede the right, but when somebody says, well, you know, I said, well, listen, I want to tell you, I've known people who walked 5 miles one way to vote, got their head beaten, come back and go back the next day, 5 miles, try to vote again. So I
believe me and my peers will vote.
Okay.
And I'm going to continue to encourage them, it's like my life depends on it, because it does. And I know it does. And it's about recognizing that.
Oh, yeah.
For sure.
The most powerful thing you can do right now,
is vote.
That's the great equalizer.
Now, before we head off, I want to just give you, Chief, the opportunity. Any advice, words of encouragement?
Yes, I would say keep fighting the fight. You know, there is not any period in our history in this nation, even how this nation was formed, that didn't come with protest, that didn't come with a resistance to change, and particularly when we talk about civil rights for people of color. Every victory has been met with resistance, has been met with a resistance to change, and somebody had to have the courage to sacrifice it all to fight for others.
Yes.
And that is not a very comfortable position to be in. You know, the comfortable thing to do, because it's very easy to just kind of sit back and let others fight for you. Keep fighting the fight. And the other thing I will say is, you know, with youth and the unlimited possibilities of not being limited to what can't be is really important, because, you know, there are some of us, as we get older, you know, you get kind of limited, you get experience and wisdom and all that. You know, when you're young, there's a certain degree of power that comes with not fearing what's behind that door. because you don't know what to expect when you open that door.
Yeah.
Marry that with the ability to have a seat at the table. You know, you have access to people like Dr. Jones. You have access to people like Father Fitzgerald, who
have access to you too.
To me and others like me. So,
and I think this has just made me just remind myself that this process, this fight, this journey is about becoming comfortable with being uncomfortable. And you all, both of you have said it. And I just appreciate just this conversation that I've been able to have with you all. Beyond grateful, beyond encouraged. And I know it's time for me to wrap up, and I don't want to take too much more time. So thank you, thank both of you. I appreciate both of you. I just appreciate this dialogue that I've been able to have with you all. And now I am honored to introduce USF President, Father Paul J. Fitzgerald, to provide some closing remarks.
So thank you, Mike'l Gregory. Thank you, Professor Jones. Thank you, Chief Scott. Mike'l, I remember meeting you, I think you were a junior over at Reardon High School. You and another student gave me a tour of the campus, explained the whole program to me. And then I think towards the end I said, now, I'm sure you're a brilliant young man. You got a lot of college choices. Why don't you include USF in your search? And you did. And I know you had some other amazing options. So thank you for choosing to be a part of the Dons community. And I'm just really, really proud of, who you are becoming. And you are exemplary of so many other students here at the university. This is a Jesuit university, which means we are a socially engaged university. And, we're fortunate to have, a chief of police of the caliber of William Scott. We're really blessed to have a city administrator, Naomi Kelly, who's an alumna, a mayor, London Breed, who's an alumna. So many people leading our community in a pathway towards ever greater social justice. And I'm really proud that the University of San Francisco is an active partner with so many people in this city. We're being an active partner in the life of the city of San Francisco at a time of pandemic and economic crisis and the Black Lives Matter movement. Chief Scott, you said, we have at this moment an opportunity. And to seize that opportunity, we have to have a willingness to change. And we're only going to change if we know our history. The ancient Hebrew people, when they located time around themselves, they said that the past is in front of us and the future is behind us, because the past we can see. And so, every morning, Shema, O Israel, remember, O Israel, that the Lord your God led you out of slavery in Egypt with a strong hand and outstretched arm. So if we remember our history, and if we're ashamed of the vestiges of racism that perdure in our hearts and in our society, then we can have not only the courage to change, but also we'll know the direction that we need to move in order to affect that change. Dr. Jones has been at the heart of the history of social justice, social progress, and very quickly, was converted to a nonviolent warrior from someone who was perhaps as a younger man willing to knock somebody down who didn't, recognize his full humanity. But Dr. Jones has been, a champion of nonviolence and social justice, such that, he was willing to leave Stanford University and become a part of the University of San Francisco community a decade ago, and has been inspiring students here with his class from slavery to Obama ever since. But founding the Institute for Nonviolence and Social Justice takes the heart of Dr. Martin Luther King's dream of that promised land that we can see, but we confront hatred with love. Fierce love, courageous love, the kind of love that would lead someone to allow themselves to be beaten down again and again, but getting back up again and loving the person who is hitting them, to shame that person into change and growth so that they can reclaim their own humanity. That's the way the dream marches on. Mike'l, you're an example of USF 5, 6, 7 years ago saying, even here, we're not attracting enough Black students. 4% maybe of our freshman class would be Black identified. And then folks were transferring away because they just weren't finding, weren't feeling the love. And fortunately, Candace Harrison, I talked to her and she said, "Oh, Paul, I've got a plan. I've had the plan in my pocket for years." and so we said, okay, let's pull Pamela Ball's organ, let's pull a few more people into this. And we launched BASE and we invested money in it. We reallocated, and just as Chief Scott was talking about how right it is at times to reallocate from one set of projects to another because it's the right thing to do. In the last couple of years, we've had freshman classes that are 15% Black identified. We'll do census here in a few weeks, and we'll see if we hit 17. I'm hopeful. And our Black students are staying and thriving and leading our community. So and all together we are this one university where I like to say this, our educational mission is to ruin our students, to absolutely ruin them. They're going to be upset and impatient about social injustice for the rest of their lives, and they're going to be lifelong change agents. We're never going to get to perfection, but every day we've got to make it better, every day. So great gratitude to you, Chief Scott, for everything you're doing in and for our city. Gratitude to you, Dr. Jones, for continuing to inspire generation after generation. And Michael, to you and to all young people, whether they're here at the University of San Francisco or in the police academy, preparing, to take up their place in improving the life of every member of our community, keeping folks safe, giving folks confidence that they can walk down the street, they can go to their job, they can drive to the movies, they can do all the things post-pandemic that make this such an amazing city. So to everyone who tuned in, God bless. Thank you so much. Keep hope alive, keep the dream marching on.